Welcome to the 405th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome anthropologist Timothy Gibson, a co-author of the article Pandemic Surveillance and Homophobia in South Korea. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID calls live on weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can hear COVID calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And as always, please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, February 1st, 2022, the full vaccination rate for COVID-19 in South Korea is 84.8% and 86.9%, 84.8% in South Korea, 86.9% in China. That's according to Our World in Data. According to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center, the full vaccination rate is 79% in Japan. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. Headline is Filipino human rights head who clashed with Duterte dies of COVID. This was published October 9th, 2021 in Al Jazeera. Jose Luis Martin Gascon served as the chairman of the Commission on Human Rights, a constitutional body that probes rights issues. In a social media post, Jose Luis Martin Gascon's brother, Miguel, confirmed the news, writing in Tagalog, "Of all the battles you fought, we had to lose to COVID. Love you, big brother." The Philippine Daily Inquirer also quoted the Commission on Human Rights as saying that Gascon passed away. We've lost a human rights champion. He was not just a fellow public servant, he was also my good friend, added Senator Risa Hontiveros. A lawyer and a graduate of the University of Cambridge in the UK, he was the youngest member of the Constitutional Commission that drafted the Philippines' new constitution in 1987, following the restoration of the country's democracy. Gascon was appointed in 2015 by then President Benigno Aquino as chairman of the CHR, an independent constitutional office whose task is to look into all human rights violations as well as abuses of civil and political rights. After Aquino's term ended in 2016, Gascon continued to serve his post into the term of the incumbent Duterte. His term, which was set to expire in May of this year, 2022, is protected by the Constitution. Because of his role in investigating cases of human rights violations, he was frequently a target of Duterte's verbal attacks. In 2017, when Gascon demanded an investigation into the series of killings of mostly male teenagers linked to the war on drugs, the president falsely accused him of being gay or a pedophile. Gascon deflected the name-calling and the hurtful language, telling ABS-CBN News that he hopes the president might choose to withdraw them in order to have a common civic space. He said his role at the CHR is part of the checks and balance system of Philippine democracy. In 2018, when Duterte defended his war on drugs by declaring in his annual State of the Nation address that your concern is human rights, mine is human lives, Gascon retorted that respecting human rights and endorsing crime can never be equated. He pointed out that human rights defenders are only calling to uphold the rule of law and constitutional guarantees as the government conducts its anti-illegal drugs campaign, not impeding law enforcement. Gascon supported the investigation of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, into Duterte's war on drugs that killed thousands of impoverished Filipinos accused of using illegal drugs. Independent investigators, journalists, and witnesses have said that many of the victims were unarmed or were innocent of the crime. Human rights lawyers, groups, activists, and journalists mourned the death of Gascon. Idra Oliala, president of the National Union of Public People's Lawyers, said he was really shocked and sad to learn of the news. Another human being gone while the clowns and leeches are mocking and toying on our rights, he wrote on social media. Ed Tay, a human rights lawyer and former Supreme Court spokesman, also wrote on social media, "You were a giant for human rights. The forest is barer because of your fall, but the seeds that you planted will yield fruit." Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation for today, and I'd like to introduce my guest to you, Timothy Gibson. Timothy Gibson is a sociocultural anthropologist and postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at the University of Hong Kong. His research focuses on the intersections of security, surveillance, queer politics, and science and technology. His work has been published in Positions Transgender Studies Quarterly, Cultural Studies, and is forthcoming in Current Anthropology. Timothy Gibson, welcome to COVID Calls.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
And I should have double checked before we got on. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
You are, it's correct.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to start the way I generally do, just to find out where you're calling from and what the pandemic situation is looking like there.
Sure. So I'm here in Hong Kong, and it's a bit dicey to say the least. So Hong Kong has a dynamic, what they call the dynamic zero COVID policy, which means that they attempt to root out any local transmission, untraceable transmissions. And so for most of the pandemic, most of the COVID-19 cases have been located at the airport to imported cases, people flying into Hong Kong. And Hong Kong has had, they've done pretty well in terms of, going for long stretches of months without any local transmission. But because of Omicron around Christmas time, we've seen a pretty sharp rise, triple digits every day for the last couple of weeks. And as a result, the government has, issued a pretty stringent lockdown. Bars, restaurants, everything, they're closed after 6 p.m. Gyms, swimming pools are all shut down. Flights are suspended from Australia, Canada, France, the Philippines, India, Pakistan, the UK, and the United States until February 18th. And suspension of face-to-face teaching has gone on and will go on until February 21st. But interestingly enough, they've, as a way to kind of, get travel back and alleviate some of the stress, they've recently amended the pretty strict 21-day hotel quarantine policy to 14 days. And yet, people can't fly into Hong Kong. So it's a little, hit and miss for some.
Thanks for that snapshot. And I think people listening, particularly in the United States, might be startled to learn that there's still places in the world where something like a 21-day quarantine would exist or a zero COVID policy is in place. To the extent that there is critique of those public policies or dialogue around the wisdom of those policies and, when and how they should be modified related to something like Omicron, how does that take shape in Hong Kong? In other words, how do you follow the discussion?
It's a good question. There was an article recently in the South China Morning Post this past week of a bunch of disease experts calling for a living with type of policy as they've been adopting, in most of the world now, particularly in response to Omicron. But the problem that Hong Kong faces is, though vaccination rates are steady around 70 to 75% for 2 doses, most of those not getting vaccinated are the elderly. And so, there's a fear, particularly within the government, at least fear that they've expressed, that if they move to some other type of living with policy, that they would see a lot of elderly people die as a result. And so trying to arbitrate a living with policy versus attempting to safeguard against those, who would be hit hardest. Most of the discussion of, a different kind of way of dealing with it, excuse me, happens, in like online circles. And so, for example, there's a great Facebook group that I've been lucky enough to stumble upon when I had to travel back from the United States last year and had to go through 21 days of quarantine, about people who have went through 21 days of quarantine, foreigners who have gone through the 21 days of quarantine, looking at all the different policies, all the different rules, because they're constantly instituting new rules of, you need a test 72 hours before you board a flight to Hong Kong, and then it's 48 hours, the kind of test, the kind of, written documentation you need. And so a lot of the discussion happens in those spaces. And so to see the, South China Morning Post publish something, calling for a different approach, from these disease experts was quite impressive, I must say.
What was that 21 days like for you?
It was. So it's an interesting story, right? When I was back in the States, I actually got COVID. This was back in 2019. So this was before any kind of vaccination. It was a pretty mild case, thankfully. And so, I had recovered and had tested negative before I got onto the plane. But when you get to the airport in Hong Kong, you get tested again. And when I got tested, there was still some residual, COVID in my system. And so the test kept coming back inconclusive. So they sent me to the hospital. And then so I spent the first couple of days at the hospital in isolation until they did an antibody test. Once they did the antibody test, they could see that, oh, he already had COVID. And so then they shipped me to the hotel. It was, it was the early days of the 21-day quarantine, early days of the hotel quarantine period. And I was lucky enough to be staying in a hotel that had just opened. And so, the room was pristine. The food was much to be imagined. But, these days things are a lot more regimented. And so you can get takeout, for example, but if it has to arrive in a certain time. Otherwise, they won't deliver it to your room until the next block of allotted time. And so there's, small little rules like that they've instituted. Thankfully, I didn't go too crazy. But it was, it was a bit difficult. I'm not going to lie.
Well, I had to do 14 days arriving here almost exactly a year ago in South Korea with my family. And I had the idea it was going to be a great, we're going to do some writing, play games with the family, a bit of a rest. And of course, multiple different things collided that I should have been expecting. One is that nobody stopped working. Those of us who are in jobs where we can pivot to sort of our online life have done so. And then also just being inside that much was really, and I'm trying to give some context here. It's not like I'm an essential worker and had to put my life on the line, but psychologically, I found it much harder than I was expecting. I don't know if that resonates for you.
For sure. I mean, I isolated, 4 walls, the room was small enough to begin with, had to do your own laundry in the sink. That was, they gave you some detergent to deal with that. But yeah, I mean, life went on because I had, I was teaching my first 2 classes while, in quarantine. And so, for the mental stability, was suffering at some point, but then I also had to perform, and so it was this constant jockeying between, woe is me and, oh, I'm, responsible for these 35 students. And so I have to, put on a happy face in some ways. So it was an interesting experiment, to say the least.
Let me just remind everyone that you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking today to anthropologist Timothy Gibson, and we're going to talk now about some of your work, Timothy, particularly a piece that you published with the Social Science Research Council, Pandemic Surveillance and Homophobia in South Korea, and you did this with Wong-Kun Chun, and this appeared September 23rd of 2021, and I'm going to put a link up to this in a minute so people can find that. So, pandemic surveillance and homophobia in South Korea. Give us a little background how you came to this study.
Sure. So, Wangun and I, we've known each other for a number of years, and we decided that so a little context, I'm sure you've given lots of context with regards to Korea, but in the early days of the pandemic in Korea, they, tracked it in terms of outbreak, the first outbreak, the second outbreak, third outbreak in small clusters. The second outbreak of COVID in May 2020 was within designated bars and clubs that later were, called online and in newspapers and the media as gay clubs and gay bars. And as a result, there was this massive uptick in homophobia spreading throughout the nation, blaming queer folks, LGBTQ plus folks, for the latest outbreak in COVID. And what we were finding what I initially noticed in these media reports and in these discussions and in this homophobia, as much homophobia is attacking the morality of the people, right? And so here we started to see, this connection between morality and COVID. And so Wongun and I decided to apply for an SSRC, a Social Science Research Council grant in order to study not just the outbreak within the clubs, but the ways in which it affected the club goers, the queer LGBTQ plus folks, with special attention to the rise in pandemic surveillance. At the time, Korea was being praised as having the democratic response, the quote unquote democratic response to the pandemic, in juxtaposition to a place like China that was instituting massive lockdowns of cities. Korea was able to stay relatively open and use surveillance technologies in order to contact trace more precisely. And as a result, all of these surveillance technologies were being collected together in order to create this pretty massive pandemic surveillance system that we thought needed some critique, some discussion outside of the quote unquote democratic response that it was getting. And so we devised a study to look at both this system and the effect that this system had on the people it was targeting, namely queer folks, linked to this one outbreak in these spaces. And so what we ended up doing was over about 6 or 7 months, we interviewed 24, 25 different in-depth interviews with folks associated with this particular outbreak on these spaces, in addition to doing some digital ethnographic work on online forums to trace some of the things that we were finding in the interviews on online spaces, and then tried to piece together what this surveillance system was. And so the piece that we wrote for SSRC was a way to look at both the surveillance system and then this response that queer human rights activists had, in response to this big outbreak.
One of the things you note in the piece is that there's a legacy of the government's response to the MERS outbreak a few years ago, 2015, and the government then was faulted for not being transparent enough about the way it handled data. And of course, that administration had its own problems, many problems related to the lack of transparency, to put it mildly. But say a little bit more about that legacy and how it then shapes government decision early in 2020 to install this sort of surveillance methodology.
Right. So as you noted, the issue of transparency, but also what was interesting about that 2015 outbreak of the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, MERS, was that many of the necessary policies or many of the public health institutions and policies were already in place for a number of years. They had been in place since the WHO, the World Health Organization, created a type of massive template for the world for types of pandemic epidemic responses, infectious disease responses. And so Korea had these plans in place that they just didn't follow themselves. And so in many ways, the COVID response was a way to, go back to those original plans and to intensify them in some ways. And so one of the ways in which they did this was with the Infectious Disease Control and Prevention Act, the IDCP Act, which allowed relevant public health agencies to request personal information for public health and scientific purposes. What initially, the original way in which this act was used, or the original way in which government organizations could request information, was that the Korean Center for Disease Control, the KCDC, would have to petition the National Police Agency for relevant personal information. The police agency would then, arbitrate the request and provide it to the KCDC. Nowadays, what they're able to do is bypass, in some ways, the National Police Agency altogether. The initial request goes through them, but when it comes back, it doesn't have to go back through the National Police Agency. So there's a lot more fluidity in terms of the types of requests being made. And so what ends up happening is that, they're able to collect, the Korean Center for Disease Control is able to collect all of this personal information based on the auspices of a public health outbreak, pandemic. Interestingly enough, what we also found was that in the wake of COVID-19, a number of different ministries within the Korean government band together to create what's called the Epidemic Investigation Support System, the IEISS. And what it does is it's this online system that coalesces all of this data, that they're able to input data at all different levels. So, through immigration, once you go through immigration, they're able to use the system, any type of public health venue that you go to. And it coalesces all this data that then is able to be called upon when needed, when there's suspected cases, when there are, they're attempting to do some sort of contact tracing. And all of this is coming as a result of, the MERS outbreak because of, issues around transparency, but also because, the bureaucracy behind MERS wasn't, was thought of as lacking as well. The government's handling of it, from a bureaucratic standpoint, was thought of as being problematic.
Well, thank you for that background. So then, when it's getting deployed, let's talk a little bit about why then early in 2020, it targets LGBTQ people in South Korea. I mean, you talked a little bit about how the data is collected. And so it has a little bit to do about where people were, and it has a little bit to do about the kinds of questions that are asked in the clinic, I suppose.
Yeah.
How does it come together as a piece of data that then becomes public, I guess, for anyone in South Korea who's following the pandemic to take note of?
So, it's like you noted, there are a couple different ways in which, we see this system come into contact then with, your ordinary person, particularly with, those being targeted here, queer folks. It has to do, so part of the data that's being collected, cell phone GPS data, facial recognition software is a new, facial recognition data is a new variant that they've started collecting. Financial data, social media data, and sometimes CCTV camera data. And so when, if queer folks are in bars and clubs, for example, during the May 2020 outbreak, and they're using their, they use their cell phone in these spaces, and they use their credit cards for financial transactions, the EISS is able to triangulate, cell phone GPS data, financial transactions, if they post on social media, they're able to triangulate this data, these data points into a picture of who this person is. What gets then shared with the public is a bit it's a bit, I don't want to say controversial, but it's a bit evolving. It's evolving in terms of what gets shared. Originally, they would share things like the gender of the individual, any kind of notable characteristics. Sometimes activists noted that they were sharing information around where listing what kind of places people were going to, not just the places, but that they were gay bars or gay clubs, right? That that the age, the types of professions that they had, where they live. And the problem at the time, to take this into consideration, is that this is also being filtered through a news agent, a set of news agencies that are already linking this outbreak to queer spaces, right? And so here you have all of this data that's being transmitted to the public at the time of essentially queer folks, right? So because the only people getting tested, the only people who are testing positive, the only suspected cases at this time in May 2020 are being associated with these queer spaces, that any of this data that then gets shared with the public is essentially a list of queer folks, right? And I should give a broader, if it's okay, a broader
Yeah,
picture.
let's talk a little bit about why that matters. I mean, I think maybe a
Yeah.
little bit of a landscape of the status of gay rights
Mhm.
in South Korea.
Sure. So there are no legal protections for LGBTQ folks in South Korea. But at the same time, there are no laws prohibiting LGBTQ folks, LGBTQ sexualities, or anything like that, except in the military. The military has an anti-sodomy law. All men are required to serve at least 18 months in the military. And so queer activists, deem that a de facto anti-gay law for Korea itself, and so they're working to get that repealed, though it's been unsuccessful for the past 10 years or so in their attempts. There's no marriage equality. There's HIV/AIDS is highly stigmatized. Most people don't come out as a result of resulting from really stringent, family norms, heteronormative, the nuclear family of mom, dad, and the kids. And there's also a pretty strong evangelical conservative Christian contingency in Korea that is, a big factor in this type of anti-LGBT protesting that takes place in Korea. It's mostly driven by an evangelical right that is tied to a lot of conservative politicians as well. But interestingly enough, the current president, Moon Jae-in, who is a former human rights lawyer, has publicly opposed homosexuality as well, in numerous ways. And so there's this setting, this context of in some ways secrecy, but in some ways also it's being heavily tied to a sense of morality, right? That to be gay is to be immoral, is to be sick, is to be diseased, right? It's to be HIV positive. Interestingly enough, to go back to COVID for a moment, in the wake of the May 2020 outbreak, you had some public health, not experts, public health officials or workers at these testing facilities asking folks about their HIV status. Coming out of May 2020, again, the only people who were associated with the outbreak were considered to be queer or gay. And so as a result, you have an essentially this type of configuration where people who are gay are HIV positive and they have COVID, and that's a danger, right? It's a moral danger. And so a lot of sexuality discourse in Korea is being tied to morality, which isn't all that surprising given the history of sexuality discourse within the world.
So when you were following closely the media reports,
Mhm.
and maybe you can help me a little bit with this on how mainstream
Yeah.
this gets in South Korea.
Yeah.
I follow the English language outlets
Right.
as closely as I can, but the extent to which those media outlets are tying this outbreak in May of 2020
Mhm.
to what would be considered an alternative or even quote unquote a deviant kind of lifestyle. So was that being made explicitly? That sort of connection was being made explicitly in the media, and I asked that question because then that sort of fits into a framework in which you say, look, if you're playing by the rules of
Mhm.
society,
Mhm.
then COVID's not a problem for you. Please follow all of the
Yeah.
appropriate public health directives. But what's just one level below that is a stigmatization of lifestyle,
Right.
which then sort of bursts into the open. Was that really openly sort of discussed by the media, or was it always a little bit sub rosa?
It was it depends on who you would ask, right? In terms of, from the media that I was following, right? It was always a bit sub rosa. It was always a bit right below the epidermis, in a sense, right? Right below the surface. Though there were some extremely right, Christian newspapers that were really, hitting home the immorality and the immoral practices. Um, but the reason why I say, it depends on who you ask is because queer activists, one of the things that they did as a result of, this outbreak, or in response to this outbreak, rather, was that they would hold daily press conferences and daily accountability, essentially doing a daily accountability of the Korean press, of pinpointing which presses, which newspaper outlets, media outlets were crossing the line in terms of stigmatization, marginalization, and homophobia, right? Which presses were saying too much or were being too direct in their pigeonholing of queer folks, or their calling out of queer folks as being immoral. And so you had those cases, right? You had mainstream media reporting on it, right, and reporting on what clubs people were being attended to, associating those clubs with queer spaces. Some media, again, were a little bit closer to the tying it to a morality. But a lot of that discussion was also happening in online forums, in daily conversations, in the opinion pieces, right, as opposed to the supposed fact-based pieces. And so there you started to see, for example, Pink News reported on, and I can send you the link later. I have it somewhere. But Pink News reported on suspected people on YouTube who were attempting to out queer folks on YouTube, right? In response to this outbreak. We had some people that we interviewed, for example, who were in the military at the time, and one guy was talking about how when the outbreak happened, all of his fellow soldiers, he's like, yeah, about 99% of his fellow soldiers started cursing at queer folks, right, and started going off on making these homophobic slurs, all around him, right, not knowing, of course, that he himself is queer. But this became, in the interviews that we did, this became a very big factor. People were scared. People were fearful about losing their jobs, about being
Sure.
outed, and it was quite frightening for them.
I want to just highlight that you wrote an article that appeared in the East Asia Forum. This was in December of
Mhm.
2021, titled "The Queer Way of South Korea," and there you write about, I think, what we would call pride festivals. You're talking about the Seoul Queer Culture Festival held at the
Mhm.
Seoul City Hall Plaza, which has been
Mhm.
growing steadily since 2015. I just want to quote a line from it here. You write, in this landscape, the record number of queer culture festival participants is a significant statement. There are lesser known gains by the LGBTQ community that deserve greater international attention. The last 10 years, you write, have seen queer culture festivals emerge in locations throughout South Korea, including in Daegu, Busan, Jeju Island, Jeonju, Gwangju, and Gyeongnam. So I mean, that's a really interesting convergence. So you're tracking basically, LGBTQ rights and the growth of
Mhm.
rights and the battle
Mhm.
over cultural acceptance in South Korea. And then here comes the pandemic
Yeah.
and that intersection, and this surveillance model is imposed. How big of a setback is that
Yeah.
for LGBTQ advocates in South Korea and around the world? I mean, we're talking about South Korea, but everything
Right.
that's
Right.
happening in South Korea here is playing out in other countries as
For sure.
well. This stigmatization and marginalization within the context of the state assuming special rights, powers during the pandemic.
Right. Right.
So how big of a setback is it? I don't know how you would even measure that, but
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question, and one that, I've been thinking about lately, and talking to some of my activist colleagues and interlocutors in Korea. I think part of the setback has to do with the the outbreak itself. The second outbreak, within these queer spaces was definitely, it fell within, in my own research, it kind of fell within, what was to be expected in some senses. When MERS, with the MERS epidemic, there was a similar type of discourse being peddled by these anti-LGBT protesters around its so-called super virus, that AIDS and MERS were going to combine within the bodies of homosexuals and form this super virus. I mean, it's a pretty ludicrous claim, but this was being peddled in mainstream discourse, not on the news, but people would know about this because of online forums. And so with COVID, it kind of was ramped up, of course, but it was not for queer folks in Korea. For me, it wasn't all that surprising that this type of association would happen. And I would say that actually one of the most inspiring things that came out as a result was that queer activist response actually had some pretty long-lasting effects. The type of data that was being shared with the public was amended as a result of queer activist response. The different city public health ordinances that govern what public health workers during testing could ask and talk about also was amended as a result of this. And so queer activists had some pretty big impact on actual policy and actual guidelines, which was phenomenal in a lot of ways. The government human rights campaign, the National Human Rights Committee, they all came out and sort of tried to say marginalization and depression and homophobia at this time isn't going to help us. We need to get past that. And so that was big for queer activists. But I think one of the largest problems that queer activism, queer rights is facing in Korea, and I would also argue worldwide, is that because a lot of activities were halted, a lot of the idea of marginalization kind of went out the window, right? Of stigmatization, that we're not focused on that right now. We need to focus on getting through this virus and getting through this pandemic. And as a result, things like an anti-discrimination law, repealing the anti-sodomy law in the military, they just go on hold. And a lot of those offline spaces as well then, migrate to online. And as it's great, but it doesn't create the same sense of community that it would offline. And one of the drawbacks to this as well is that a lot of these gay bars and clubs, as a result, have closed and will never recover in some ways because of this association, because of that May 2020 outbreak.
I want to ask you sort of a broader question just
Yeah.
about disease and surveillance.
Hmm.
Um, because when we look, start to compare the approaches of different countries. I mean, in the United States, generally, I could say very early, the government gave up. The federal
Yeah.
government gave up on the idea that you would do some aggressive track and trace kind of
Yeah.
and the idea that you would, download apps on your phone where you would receive, daily text messages from the president of your country or from local health
Right.
officials, the many things we get used to in South Korea, the sort of constant flow of information about what's going
Right.
on with the pandemic, just completely not unacceptable to some in the United States, but
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
there's no capacity for it. So that surveillance discussion hasn't really had traction in the U.S. But
Yeah.
thinking about it in South Korea, or like where you are in Hong Kong, other parts of Asia and Australia that have
Mhm.
pursued really aggressive either zero COVID or really stringent COVID restrictions.
Mhm.
Um, I wonder how you think about the deployment of this technology. I mean, because it sort of taps into a broader discourse around the surveillance state. And you mentioned
Mhm.
CCTV cameras and the aggregation of data, which is potentially tracking people's financial movements and their physical movements
Yeah.
all around. So, sometimes this gets very high flown and not really based in empirical data.
Yeah.
It's like, Big Brother is there, and if you want to find
Right.
him, go to Asia to find. And in Western media, sometimes early on, and I think even still now, it that kind of coverage is racist or quasi-racist to me.
Oh, for
It's
sure.
like people in Asia are as if Asia is a place, and
Right.
so there's a lot of complicated layers to this with
Mhm.
with these cameras and these tracking
Mhm.
maps in the center of it. How do you find your way through that sort of theoretical tangle
Yeah.
to make sense of what's really happening and the long-term impact it'll have on democracies like South Korea?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think, as an anthropologist, for me, I always go back to the interlocutors. I always go back to the data itself, right? And so we we talked to folks who were being affected by all of this, right? Whether they knew they were being affected by it or not. And what's interesting in what we found was, we found many who were quite fearful of being tracked, right? Of being outed as a result. People who, quit their jobs as opposed to, being outed in terms of of any kind of information getting out, right? They would rather quit their jobs, even if they took time to get tested, right? They knew that if they got tested, that was going to out them in some ways because that was being associated with queer spaces and queer folks. And so, most of what we were looking at were how were people themselves understanding this technology? Because you're absolutely right. When we talk about the surveillance state and surveillance technologies, there are many different ways in which we can come at it. But, for me, coming at it from the ground up, looking at the people who are affected by it and how they're affected, whether it be actual, we've had some cases where, folks would get calls, even though they never gave their phone number to any, government institution or whatnot, they would get calls because the government had triangulated their data to being in those spaces. And so they would get calls to say, oh, you need to go get tested. And so there were incidences of that. But on the other side of that too, which is interesting, is that you had several who thought that the government handling of the situation was just, you had some who thought it was abysmal because of it was docking human rights. On the other side, you had, those queer folks who thought, well, we're in a pandemic. What else are we going to do? It's an emergency. We have to do this, right? And so they kind of saw it as an inevitable situation, right? Particularly in Korea,
Mm.
where they thought, well, given Korea's high throughput in terms of, internet data trafficking and its, technological advancement, how is this any different than what was going on before? It's just aggregating all the stuff to one central location. For some, they thought, well, this was always going to happen.
There's a tie-in here. I know you do HIV
Mhm.
AIDS research as
Yeah.
well. Maybe you can help me with this. I mean, there's really, to me, a fascinating tie-in here with the problem of testing in
Yeah.
the history of the LGBTQ community. And,
Mhm.
early in the HIV, in the earlier days of HIV, this idea of getting tested, well, when testing became available,
Yeah.
that became a point at which public health officials I think, really struggled because they wanted people to get tested, but they want to be able to
Mhm.
know where the disease is. But I think within the community, of course, as you've just described, I mean, that's really complicated,
Yeah,
right? I mean, it's not as if people want to be sick,
right,
but they're balancing a number of different risks that they face in their daily life. I mean, you pointed out, loss of family connection,
right,
community, loss of job, or violence
right.
itself. And so, even what you just described, really striking to me. Somebody maybe having to make the choice. Well,
Mhm.
maybe I just won't know if I have COVID,
Yeah,
or defying some government order that I have to be tested
yeah,
versus these other things that might happen to me. It's almost an impossible set of choices for someone to have to
right,
make, I think.
right. For sure, and what happened. So after the May 2020 outbreak, initially, COVID tests were not anonymous. You had to give your ID, you had to record who you were whenever you got tested. And it wasn't until after this May 2020 outbreak where thousands of people needed to get tested, but no one was getting tested, right? Because they were fearful that getting tested, because it wasn't anonymous, it would out them. And so one of the things that queer activists did actually as a result was push the government to make testing anonymous. And so all you had to do was give your phone number as a result. But and then people started to get tested. But what was interesting is that in the data we found, those people that we interviewed, some questioned the very notion of anonymous testing. They said, at this point, what does it matter? Because anyone who gets tested is already being associated with these with these spaces. And so being tested itself is the danger here. And trying to work around that, for activists in particular, trying to find a way to, getting tested is necessary. We need to know who, for your safety, but for other people's safety, we need to know, right? With interestingly enough, with HIV testing, in Korea as well, if you get tested with a doctor, it goes into your public insurance records, right? Which is true in the United States, that when you get tested with a doctor as opposed to a center where you can remain anonymous, it goes into your insurance, and there's a public record of, or not a public record, but there's a record of getting tested and the testing results. The same in Korea. And so, there are some anonymous testing centers that you can go to get tested, which is part of, HIV/AIDS education in Korea and push. But, getting tested is like you said, it's a precarious thing. And the very
Mhm.
notion of the test is very precarious.
Just a quick reminder that you're listening to COVID Calls and having a really fascinating conversation today with anthropologist Timothy Gibson about his work with his co-author Wonkan Chun, Pandemic Surveillance and Homophobia in South Korea, which appears in the items collection of the Social Science Research Council. And just a shout out to the SSRC. I've been, full disclosure, I've also been curating with colleague Alexa Dietrich, who's a genius researcher in her own right. We've been curating pieces around disaster studies issues as well. So SSRC has really been supporting a lot of important work through this
Yeah.
pandemic, and I just wanted to highlight that. Timothy, let me come back. We have a few minutes left. I just want to come
Mhm.
back again, sort of a broader question here about the implications of this work as we think about marginalized populations in any country.
Yeah.
Um, that finds themselves, here in this tight spot between, public safety and identity and
Yeah.
disclosure. And because, what you've shown here are all of the many nuances and layers to what this means for LGBTQ rights in South Korea, but there are many different types of marginalized populations that have, I expect, also found themselves in a tight spot because of this kind of deployment of technology or close governmental scrutiny throughout the
Mhm.
pandemic. And
Mhm.
again, sometimes we think of it in the opposite in the United States. It's that the government didn't care to scrutinize the
Right.
situation in nursing homes, for example. And
Right.
so thousands and thousands of seniors died because the government wasn't it wasn't carrying out its responsibilities.
Mhm.
The framework that you're discovering here is a bit not the opposite, but it's quite different. But what are the
Yeah.
impacts for other marginalized groups, do you think?
It's a good question. So in Korea, for different marginalized groups in Korea, for HIV positive folks, for example, which aren't always, with HIV positive folks, you see this type of double oppression. Some of the research that we did highlights this type of double oppression that they feel oppressed because they're HIV positive and feel oppressed because they're potentially, that they potentially have COVID. And that kind of, the sickliness, right, the diseaseness of the body gets called into question, right? The livelihood of the body. Is the body actually productive? Can it, fit within, within society? But I think we've seen the ways in which COVID has affected, race relations in the United States, Europe, in many countries, with reference to the virus originating, from China. Even in places like, Korea and Hong Kong, you still see some of that as well, interestingly enough, some of that association with mainland China as the originator of the virus. And so, folks trying to navigate internet, for example, students in the United States trying to navigate, international students trying to navigate, COVID life amidst, amidst this type of intense racial backlash, I think, is demonstrative of this. But in terms of how surveillance technologies come into play, I think part of it is, we may see, for example, certain spaces, right, getting outed as, oh, these are hotspot spaces, right? The way that queer spaces were considered hotspots, or churches prior to the May 2020 outbreak. The first outbreak in Korea was with a church, right? And so, I think space becomes a very important factor here. But I think, we talked a little bit about, the mental effect that a lot of, isolation has and quarantining has. But, for certain populations that require, or not require, but that are based in spaces, right? Bars, clubs, churches, whatnot, when they have to move online, a lot of that community gets lost, and so we're losing a lot of community in these space, in this move to online. I think, there's a lot of pros to it, of course, but, when we're moving from a place-based community to an online-based community, forced to, that community suffers.
I've heard similar kinds of discussion about communities that are in addiction treatment in the
Yeah.
United States, for example. People being who are already facing stigma and challenges, and then they're forced into online spaces, and the
Right.
erosion of community can be life-threatening.
Yeah.
And there's another part of this which you signaled earlier, which I think is, to me, really fascinating and worth underlining, is that also this sort of tendency to rush to a kind of a patient zero attitude
Yeah.
in the pandemic or with any kind of disease outbreak. And I think this is true with HIV/AIDS too.
Mhm.
Well, we're just going to find out where it started.
Yeah.
We're going to find out, and oftentimes this plays into other narratives around intruders and
Yeah.
immigrants. It's coming from somewhere else. We need to track it. It's going to be a few individuals, and we're going to isolate them, or we're going to move them out.
Mhm.
That was the reaction to the Omicron variant, and
Right.
countries
Right.
put these travel bans on. Omicron was readily circulating in all of these countries already that put the travel
Mhm.
bans, but there was something psychologically satisfying, I think, to some,
Yeah.
to perform that. And I guess there's a sort of performative governmentality aspect to it as well. At least we're doing something, and the thing we can do
Mhm.
is ultimately, I think, from a public health perspective, and I'm going to stay in my lane here, but from what I've read, it's
Mhm.
not necessarily effective. What's more effective are real public health measures, making
Right.
sure that the hospitals have the supplies they need, people have the economic support they need to not go to work, rather than trying to find the few, diseased miscreants in society and track them.
Right. There's a great book by Priscilla Wald called Contagious. And what's nice about the book is that, she talks about this outbreak narrative, and she talks exclusively about patient zero and how patient zero discourse, was originating around the first case of HIV/AIDS, right? And how that discourse was, trying to trace, patient zero down to, down to the first case, right? This is in my broader research around HIV/AIDS and the Middle East respiratory syndrome. I found some of this discourse come out in terms of the ways in which activists were responding to not just a patient zero or the first case, but around a type of pure space, right? To have some sort of purity, right? That we have a disease-free environment, disease-free space, which involves, of course, tracking who is the first person and working outwards. But activists, queer activists, HIV/AIDS activists, in response to that with MERS, a lot of them started to talk about, well, we can't really have this flight of fancy around purity is actually quite dangerous, because what it does is it erodes the very real experiences that people are having right now. Particularly people who have MERS or suspected MERS patients, or people who are HIV positive. And so a lot of these activists used HIV and the ways in which they live with HIV to create this type of living with paradigm for disease, which I think is quite relevant today as many countries move to this living with paradigm with COVID.
That's a really interesting connection. We're almost up on time in the COVID calls discussion today with Timothy Gibson. I just want to circle back to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Similar kind of surveillance and LGBTQ situation unfolding there, or has it been different from what we've been discussing in South Korea?
It's been a bit different from my, from what I understand. I'm definitely not an expert on LGBT rights here in Hong Kong, but from what I think, we see a lot of this migration onto online spaces, particularly because in Hong Kong there's just a lot of regulation around what kinds of spaces are open, and so bars and clubs, right? Those types of spaces are closed right now. And there have been months on end where they've been closed, and so that type of migration to online spaces, I think, is happening more readily. But in terms of surveillance and whatnot, Hong Kong's also dealing with other issues that would predispose it to a certain kind of surveillance system and whatnot. But from my research, it's not necessarily the same kind of it's maybe not at the same level. I think a lot of it is based on independent contact tracing, or individual using what's called the Stay at Home Safe app or Leave Home Safely app, where you have a QR code and you scan it, right? Whenever you go someplace. And so they're making that mandatory in most spaces, public spaces now, where you have to scan it if you go someplace. And now they're looking at creating a vaccine bubble around if you go into a restaurant or you go into a mall or whatnot, you need to have at least one dose of the vaccine in order to enter certain spaces.
What a time to be a postdoctoral researcher in Hong Kong, doing the kind of ethnography that you do, Timothy. Just a sort of last note on that. I mean, what's next in line for you in terms of projects? I mean, how are you? And I guess, I think about how many conversations I've had with researchers who are like, well, I'm just waiting till the summer. I'm just waiting till the fall. I'm just waiting and just waiting and just waiting. And I'm sure, I mean, you've had to adapt your methodology to work online. Others have as well. What are you working on next?
So my next big project is all about viruses, interestingly enough. And so not just infectious diseases, but the social and cultural interpretations of viruses in Asia. And so part of this came out of COVID, but part of it came out of being in Hong Kong and seeing the response and seeing how viruses get narrated in public life. And so pulling from not just ethnographic research, but from, discourse analysis, film literature analysis, trying to be a lot more interdisciplinary with this approach just because of the, the situation. And so that's kind of, where the research is heading, is looking more into, how do we understand viruses as not just a moment of crisis, but a moment of routine, right? How do we routinize viruses in daily life?
You've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can usually catch COVID Calls live at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And I want to thank my guest today, Timothy Gibson. Fantastic work you're doing, and really appreciate you going through it so carefully and talking about every aspect of it. Timothy, best of luck with the work to come.
Thank you very much for having me.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you next time on COVID Calls.